probably worth getting started at this point. My name's Alex Iltz. I'm the producer of the Petri Dish, which is brought to you by the College of Biological Sciences at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. And this is also, we do this in collaboration with the Bell Museum and also with the Institute on the Environment. For those of you that haven't attended a Petri Dish before, normally these conversations are held in an informal setting. Typically we're at a bar where we can relate how biology affects our lives and what it means for the future. Like almost everything during all of this, we have moved online. And so here we are, which is great because we can bring in people from further afield that may not have a chance to otherwise hang out with us. So welcome everybody. There are a few quick announcements that I want to get through, and I believe there are some slides that'll pop up for that too, which is kind of awesome. So if you like this Petri Dish conversation, come back again virtually next month, and we will be back again to discuss, you know, just little things, the origin of life, just details. That one should be an awesome conversation as well. I'm pumped about that too. Also, there's spooky science going on at the Bell Museum, which continues through Sunday, October 31st. Stop by there, check out special Halloween themed activities. Those include creepy specimens, skeletal sketching, a scavenger hunt, special planetarium show. And then on Saturday, November 6th, meet fisheries scientists and explore the incredible diversity of fishes and fantastic fishes during their monthly Spotlight Science event. You can get more information at the URL up there of bellmuseum.umn.edu. I know there was some folks that wanted me to read off every URL tonight, but I'll do a few. Also, the College of Biological Sciences and the Office of the Vice President for Research are hosting a conversation on the bioeconomy. Minnesota made, growing the bioeconomy. And that's next week on November 4th. And you can learn more at the URL and register up there, but you can also learn more at z.umn.edu/MN bioeconomy. And that should be a pretty cool thing to check out as well. And it is in the chat, which is advantageous. This evening, however, we have 3 university researchers here for what is going to be a very cool event and a conversation about urban nature. I'm really pumped about this. We typically kick things off with trivia. Normally, we'd have little prizes and stuff, which we can't, do at the moment. But we have got some great questions, and we're going to go to Claire. Hi, Claire. And she's going to lead us through some of the trivia events or the trivia topics for today. She's a science communicator who translates complex research for a general audience, even can manage to explain things to me. So
I try my best. Not every time, but it's a fun journey. Well, I started launching the trivia a little bit earlier, so some people might have already seen the first poll, but let me go ahead and launch that first question again. Hopefully everyone can see this. About how many storm drains are in St. Paul and Minneapolis? Is it 50,000? Is it 80,000? Or is it 125,000? All right, seems to be a close race. We'll give people another 5 seconds to get their answers in. All right, so let's share these results out. So it's pretty close between 80,000 and 125,000. With my rough estimates, and I always take criticism. So with my calculations and a little searching, I found 80,000 storm drains. All right, let's get to the second poll here. Second question. So this takes people back to June 2018. And while it doesn't reference the blizzard of 1991, which I've heard about at length in the last 10 days on NPR, it does take us to a rather well-known occasion that happened on the USB tower in St. Paul. So What critter traversed that tower? Give people a couple more seconds here. All right, I'll go ahead and close it out. So it seems like, overall people remember the NPR raccoon. We do have couple squirrel votes. I'm very curious for the cat voters, if people have a cat or if they've ever seen the USB tower, because I would love to meet their cat or be terrified one way or the other. When this happened, I was still living in Washington, D.C., and I alerted all of my colleagues that this was happening, and they were very confused why I was so invested in this raccoon. But it invested a lot of people in its journey. All right, let's do another one. About how many crows, which I learned today are called the Minneapolis mega murder, make their home in Loring Park in the winter? Give it another 5 seconds here. All right, well, I feel excited. So the answer here is actually 10,000. Estimated about 10,000 crows make their home in Loring Park. And I don't know if everyone has seen the site of all the crows kind of nesting or roosting or whatever the proper verb is for what crows do together, but it is a pretty impressive site over there. Very on brand for this time of year, I will say. All right, we got one more here. So this is another St. Paul question, kind of interesting as I live in Minneapolis, but St. Paul Union Depot back in 2020, what animal strolled across the depot parking ramp? All right, we'll give it another couple seconds here. And it was indeed the black bear, although I would have loved to see if the moose would have made it through the clearance in that parking ramp. So I know we focus mostly on animals in the trivia today. There are a lot more topics that you all are going to discuss during the Petri Dish. I did forget to mention in my very first question about the storm drains that part of the reason why we wanted to include that mention is a plug to adopt a storm drain. It's one of the very first things I found about when I moved to the city, and I thought it was the most delightful advertising campaign in which a small child was told they could not have a pet and instead they had a storm drain. So we'll put a link in the chat to adopt a storm drain. And it sounds like from Sarah, there are always storm drains that are ready to be adopted.
Well, thank you, Claire, and also for the plug for Adopt a Storm Drain. Now I'd like to welcome the Dean of the College of Biological Sciences, Valerie Forbes, to say a few words before we get started with our conversation.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Claire. I think this was the first time that I got most, but not all, of the trivia questions correct. I'm very excited.
Good work.
It's probably a one-off. Well, welcome everybody to the College of Biological Sciences Petri Dish. As some of you know, this is one way that we try to share our science with the broader community. We're really happy that you decided to enter our virtual Petri Dish this evening and be part of our latest experiment. And I encourage you to be active participants. So for these conversations, we bring together people from our college, the university, and beyond who have expertise and a point of view to share around topics of broad interest with a biological bent. So this evening, we're going to be talking about urban nature, the subject of an ambitious new long-term research project led by Dr. Sarah Hobbie, which you'll hear about in a minute. While we tend to think of nature as something apart from cities, maybe with the exception of green spaces set aside for recreation, it's not only present in cities, but urban nature impacts us in many different ways. Decisions about how land is used shape the environment, which in turn shapes us in ways we may not even be aware of. So it's therefore critical that we consider the social and political dimensions of land use in urban areas and think about issues of equity and inclusion. As cities become home to an ever larger portion of the population, not to mention black bears and raccoons and crows, this topic becomes more and more important since good policies require deep understanding of the dynamics at work. And this is true whether we're talking about pristine areas like boundary waters or densely populated urban areas like the Twin Cities. So with that, I hope you'll join in with your own questions and comments. Thank you for being here this evening and enjoy the discussion.
Thanks, Valerie. Well, without further ado, well, a little more ado before we get on to the main event, I do want to say that we really want you to submit your questions. So we want to hear from you, and in the chat function, you'll be able to submit questions and they will go directly to Claire, who is going to do an excellent job of aggregating that behind the scenes. And I am going to be checking in with her a few times during the conversation. We'll break away so that we can come and check in and find out what questions people have. So if you have a question, submit it right away, and Claire will start putting those together because I'm going to check in with her a few times. We turned the closed captioning on. And so if you would like to turn that off, there is a little option down below where you can get rid of the closed captioning. We're also recording this, and then this recording will be posted at an undisclosed time after the event is over. So enough with all the tech and the Zoom stuff. At this point, I really just want to get to it and introduce our guests. And so it's become a custom for us for them to answer sort of a silly question along with talking a little bit about what they do. And so this time around, I'm curious what the most surprising thing is that someone has responded to them when they've mentioned that they work on urban nature, because I feel like there might be some weird things in there. So with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Sarah Hobbie, who is a distinguished McKnight University professor in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, Behavior. Her research addresses the influence of challenges in atmospheric composition, climate, land use, and plant science composition on communities and ecosystems, and effects of urbanization on biodiversity and water quality. She is currently the director of the new Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area urban long-term ecological research program. Did I get it all? Welcome. So, Sarah, if you want to take a couple of minutes maybe to tell us a little bit about your research in your own words and your interests, and then, of course, you know, what weird things people have told you when you say that you work in urban nature.
Yeah, thanks, Alex, and thanks everybody for coming. I'm sorry that we can't be in person. I've got my beer, so cheers to all of you, and hopefully the next time we get together, we can do this at the bar. What?
Is that the Keeler brewing mug or glass?
Oh, yeah, this is actually an ecology beer mug that has a very famous figure from a paper that was written by a graduate student in our program way back in the 1940s. So anyway, thanks for coming, and thanks for hosting us, Alex et al. Yeah, so I'm Sarah, and as Alex said, I'm in the Ecology, Evolution, Behavior department. So I'm an ecosystem ecologist by training, and I study mostly the effects of various global environmental changes on plants and soils and plant-soil interactions. In cities, my work has focused on understanding the patterns and consequences of variation in biodiversity, and then also the sources of nutrient pollution to stormwater. So a plug for the Adopt a Drain program. And if you do adopt a drain, make sure that you clean up the leaf litter that's upstream of your drain, not just the drain itself. I think a common misconception is that we only need to clean the drain, but we actually really need to clean upstream of the drain. So this is my chance to make that plug. And Alex told us he was going to ask us this question, and I actually can't think what.
Don't give away the secrets.
Well, but I can't actually think of like a silly thing that anyone has said to me when I've said that I work on urban nature. So I'm gonna say something that's maybe not so silly, but important, I think, which is that we were having a conversation with some folks a couple of weeks ago about this new project that we're starting. And we were talking all about urban nature and, you know, our interest in studying the interactions between people and urban nature. And this woman who's one of our community partners and is serving on our community advisory group. She's an artist and she lives in North Minneapolis. And she said, well, what do you all mean when you say urban nature? Because when I think about urban nature, I think about like my basement flooding and the ash tree that like came down in my backyard that I had to pay $7,000 to remove because it was killed by emerald ash borer. And it was kind of this, it was really like aha moment for a number of us in this conversation, because I think we often think of urban nature as this like, you know, beneficial thing, whereas she clearly had kind of an adversarial relationship with urban nature in her day-to-day experience. And so I think that highlights that urban nature isn't just this one thing. It's all about context, and it's all about, you know, who cares about what that they experience related to urban nature. And so I hope that that's something that we can chat about as this evening goes on.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, I guess if your experience with urban nature is just the rat pulling the pizza up the subway stairs in New York, it may seem adversarial. That's an interesting point. Up next is Dr. Bonnie Keeler, who's an associate professor at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, where she co-directs the Center for Science, Technology, and Environmental Policy. Welcome, Bonnie.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, so I'm saying hello from the West Bank of the University of Minnesota campus, where I'm at the Humphrey School. And I work primarily on water policy, both in urban and more rural settings. So I have an interest in the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River, and in generally how we think about management of watersheds as complex social and ecological systems. And my work in urban nature has primarily been based in an initiative that I've been leading for the last few years called the CREATE initiative, which is working with communities throughout urban areas and urban watersheds, not only in Minneapolis, but also in Atlanta and elsewhere. We're really trying to understand the relationship between investments in urban nature and the distribution of those environmental benefits and burdens. So I actually have no great punchy answer to Alex's question either. Although my like first cliche
Like I failed.
of urban nature was I taught an urban ecology class actually at Hamline University way back now. And I made my students sit outside and count squirrels. And that was like the best urban nature activity that I came up with. But now my work is not about squirrels. It's really thinking about the institutions and policies that manage urban space and urban environments, and how that affects different communities in different ways, and how we can learn from the history of how we've invested in urban nature to better inform the future policies that we make.
Excellent. Well, thanks for joining us. Finally, I would like to welcome Dr. Kristen Nelson, who's a professor in the Department of Forest Resources and in the Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology. Her research focuses on projects ranging across multiple social theories, individual behavior to international governance, as well as U.S. homeowner practices to rural landowner practices. Seems like a lot of stuff.
Yeah, one of the things that I love about what I do is that I call myself an environmental sociologist. And that basically means I can study everything from federal law down to what people do in their gardens. And so I like that transition. I like to look at it across that landscape. So in this project, the thing I'm most excited about is that we are looking at the role of advocacy. And now advocacy, you might think of people holding signs or shouting slogans, but advocacy happens across our communities as people come together and talk, as they influence decision makers, and as they influence their neighbor in what they do in their personal practices. And, there, in terms of scholarship, there's a really big gap. Now, I know that sounds like people have studied cities forever, but in reality, a lot of the work right now in policy and sociology has been at the federal level. And there's been a little bit of a disconnect with cities and municipalities that interact with people on the ground. And so that's the piece we're doing with Forrest Flashman and Bonnie and Kate. But alone, that helps me understand what the social system's doing. But what I want to know, and why I partner with Sarah and others, is I want to know, does it matter? Can you tell me if this really matters? And so trying to put all of that together and with my colleagues is just the most exciting thing. So when they come in the door to me and they say, do you work on, and they talk about a very small bug, and I go, sure, I work on social systems. That bug is in the social system, so I can work with you. So that's where I come from, and I thank them every day for the things they find out, so I can connect it to the stuff I work on. Now, I'm going to add to your urban nature piece, and I'm not so much silly, but it was surprising because the story that Sarah told is actually something that I think many assume and think is very important in terms of working with some of the challenges and the problems of flooding and asthma related to trees and pollen and things like that. But we were just sitting one of our graduate students was just sitting with a policy, newly elected official, let's say in Brooklyn Park, which is a northern suburb, and introduced the idea of urban nature. And he immediately said, oh, as a teenager in Liberia, I used to plant trees all the time, all throughout Moravia, even during the Civil War. That's what I want to do here in Brooklyn Park. And so I think sometimes the words can spark people to go, oh, something I used to do, actually, maybe I grew up on a farm, or maybe I grew up in a different country. And it actually gets them realizing, hey, we can do something here in the Twin Cities. And so that's my answer to, you'd be surprised what you'll hear when you use the term urban nature.
That was definitely not what I expected when I thought up that question, but it was glorious. I can feel your energy. I love it. So I guess the first thing that I want to ask all of you is, I don't think that I'm alone in associating the word nature with something that is apart from humans, almost opposite to humans in some ways. I tend to think of things when I hear nature like national parks or big preserve places or far off exotic locations, like polar bears are nature. The Amazon rainforest is nature. But like the roadside ditch in front of my house just doesn't, to me, evoke nature. And so I think there's a lot of ways we could start the conversation today, but perhaps we could start by all of you helping me understand what is and what is not covered by the term nature.
Yeah, so I mean, I can start. This is the awkward part of Zoom, right? Because it's really like right now, Kristen and Bonnie are tiny little boxes, so I can't tell if they were about to say something or not. So we'll just wing it here. But yeah, I mean, I don't get really hung up about definitions, honestly. I think it's all context dependent. So if we're concerned about allergens and like pollen as an allergen, then we need to worry about roadside ditches where we might find ragweed growing. And we need to worry about trees because they're a source of allergenic pollen for lots of people. If we're worried or if we're concerned about pollinators, then we need to think about certain kinds of urban nature, like people's yards. And the state of Minnesota is now got this program where they're, you know, promoting bee lawns. And so we're wondering, is that going to make a difference for the populations of pollinators in the city? If we're concerned about climate change and the urban heat island effect, then we want to understand things about the urban forest and urban tree canopy, because that can provide cooling through shade and evaporation. So I tend to have a pretty loose conception of urban nature that really depends on what is the process or the interaction. Either, you know, like I can ask straight up ecological questions that might then depend on, you know, make sense to think about certain kinds of urban nature. And then if we're thinking about interactions with people, which is a big part of what our new project is all about, then, you know, we need to think about, well, what do people care about with respect to urban nature? What are the things that they benefit from related to urban nature? Or what are the harms that they might experience related to urban nature? And so I tend to be pretty loose and inclusive. And then, you know, what really matters is, going back to the pollinator example, okay, if we're trying to understand pollinator population dynamics in this urban setting, then we need to think about, okay, where are we going to find pollinators? What are the important habitats that we need to study in order to understand the population dynamics of pollinators in the city? So my answer, yeah, tends to be fairly loose and inclusive and really context dependent. It really depends on the specific question or process or interaction that we're interested in.
I'll just pick up on that in one observation that, you know, so I've done a lot of work with conservation organizations over the last couple of decades, and there's a notable shift in how we think about and define nature. And I think it touches on what you're talking about, Alex, of what is nature? How do we think about the relationship between humans and nature? And you can really see this evolution if you look at just the taglines of some of our major environmental organizations. If you look at the Nature Conservancy, whose motto used to be saving the last great places, that's very much evoking that national park version of nature. And now the Nature Conservancy pitches themselves as preserving the lands and waters upon which all life depends. Right, so they're acknowledging the fact that nature provides these valuable benefits to people. It's much more of a anthropocentric or human-centered view of nature. And I see the trend in research really moving in that direction as well. I mean, we tried locking up nature behind national parks, and it was not effective at staving off biodiversity loss. And that was not a strategy that bore out really effectively. So conservation groups, I think the scientific community has moved much towards an embrace of social ecological systems. It's humans and nature, people and nature framing, which certainly breaks down some of those barriers between nature as this separate and humans as causing bad things to it that we need to protect it from, and underscoring the mutual reliance that we have between people and nature.
Yeah, I'd support what Bonnie was saying, and adding to that, I think one of the biggest challenges that we created as a intellectual community is the duality of nature is one thing, people are another thing, and breaking down the relationships. I think it set our science back, because we really didn't study the people side of things, whether either their values and what they would act to do or vote for, or what laws they'd put in, or just how they influence something. So a lot of several of my students and some of the work that we do now has more to do with network analysis, where all actors matter. And if you think about yourself sitting in, let's stay in, if you're in an urban space, stay in your backyard, and think about how often you look over to a particular spot where that rabbit who's been coming all summer long, and you're interacting with that rabbit, and you're interacting with the vegetation the rabbit's eating. So that's one example of that, a network analysis of how all of those actors interact with each other. So it's not sort of, it's so not separate. It's almost easier to do the science here where you have humans than pretend that, say, in the Arctic, there's no humans, so that's real nature. Well, people are influencing what's happening in the Arctic too. And so I think this is a place you can capture people's attention about science and about that interaction in an urban space. So I like it. I did sit on a desert island in the Galapagos for a long time, and it's great for a while, but those finches, not enough.
Oh, that's just heresy. No, so no, so I see what you're saying about some of the drawbacks that have come from creating this these bins of humans versus nature. Humans are distinct from nature, kind of thing. But I'm curious then, how did that view arise, and are there any benefits to it? Because it's very easy in many conversations to tear down things that have been done without thinking about whether or not there were advantages to those. And so I'm curious, are there advantages to thinking of nature as something pristine that isn't modified versus just incorporating all of it? Did I just throw a wrench in?
Sure. I mean, I think we're not throwing out the boundary waters, right? We're not saying like, let's just put humans into every situation. I think it's more an acknowledgement that there are very few systems that aren't touched by humans, that we are dependent upon the services and benefits that natural systems provide, that we play an important stewardship role, and that invoking that ethic is an important part of conservation. And that there's a whole diversity of definitions of urban nature. There's a whole diversity of experiences of nature. And that I don't think that we're in a position to exclude any of those. We really need to develop policies that acknowledge the kinds of relationships that people have with lots of different types of nature. At the same time, we should fight to protect the places that are really important and special to us. And sometimes the reason they're important and special is because they're fairly isolated from the impacts of humans. But I do think that, you could certainly critique our entire national park strategy as an effort to kick out the original inhabitants of those lands and then create them into recreational playgrounds for wealthier Americans. So no nature is divorced from its history and divorced from the social context that allowed it to arise in that state of like perceived pristine nature. So I think the work that we're doing now is just not shying away from that complexity, and it's allowing for the social context of nature to play an equal role in the way that we think about how we manage these systems.
So the idea that nature was pristine and has been studied, like when I think about things where nature has been studied, often there's a history of studying these places that are perceived as pristine. What was the impetus? What shifted some of that mindset to start studying the nature, the interactions that are in our backyards, that are on farms, that are surrounding where people have modified conditions? Was there a big momentous occasion?
I don't think there was a big momentous occasion. I mean, I think it's been sort of a gradual thing. I think it's been happening in Europe for a long time, just because that landscape is so modified. And it's actually been in the US for quite some time as well. I mean, for several decades, this program that we're funded by, the Long-Term Ecological Research Program, has had urban sites since the 90s. And the National Science Foundation has actually had programs to fund work that's looking at coupled human and natural systems, including in urban settings for quite some time. So yeah.
Side there, and can you explain to me what the long-term ecological research stations are?
Yeah, sure. So they're not stations, they're sites. So the National Science Foundation back in the 70s recognized that, and this was very much focused on ecology, alone at the time, but recognized that it's difficult to study ecological processes over the typical 3-year time span that normal NSF and other federally funded grants are funded for. And so it's changed to a 6-year timeline, but then also with the possibility for renewal. So there are right now about 28 sites in this network. They are located all the way from the Beaufort Sea. So there are actually, I think, 4 sites now in Alaska, all the way down to Antarctica. There are a couple of sites there. There's a site in Puerto Rico. There's a site in French Polynesia. There are a number of sites in the continental US. There are open ocean sites. There are terrestrial sites. There are coastal sites. And there are right now 3 urban sites in this network. So I think that it's been growing. It's been around for a while, but it's definitely federal funding from National Science Foundation, from U.S. Forest Service, and others have been increasingly realizing that this is, cities are where the majority of people live in the world. Cities are where we consume then the majority of our energy, our food, where the majority of our waste products are produced. And so we should pay attention to those systems, and we need to understand them and understand the role of people and interacting with ecosystems in cities as well as outside of cities. So I think it's been kind of a gradual shift, and it hasn't just been a US thing. It's definitely been happening in other countries. There's a lot going on in China and all around the world in this space related to urban ecology, urban nature.
Excellent. So I think now might be a good time to check in with Claire and see if we have any just burning questions that we should be addressing at this point.
Yeah, we've got a couple that have come in. I think some of them we're going to get at a little bit later, but I think this is kind of interesting and kicks off this sort of larger discussion of what is nature and how does it fit into cities. So someone asked, is humans only value to nature stewardship?
It's a good question. Who wants to take a stab at that?
No.
All right, moving on. No.
No, I mean, I think we can all identify with lots of different values. And values, that term values, is used in lots of different disciplines in different ways. So I come from an environmental economics background. So we typically use the word values as a measure of worth. So what is nature worth to me? But in other social sciences, that may be, the term values is more of guiding principles that influence your beliefs and your perspectives. So there's a lot of different ways that we use the term values. And I think most of the scholarship on values suggests that it's very context dependent, that it's very relational, and it's informed by our own preferences. And so that would mean it would certainly be very simplistic to say that humans only have one particular value for nature. I think the evidence suggests a very rich, very complex, context-dependent, dynamic relationship between humans and nature.
Excellent.
I mean, I'll just go to your side. Remember, I'm the sociologist, so I might use the wrong term here, but humans are really effective organisms to transfer all sorts of bugs, diseases, and things wherever they want to go. And so those humans are really good vectors for things. And so I think it's so hard to separate the human being from nature. And I think the urban side for me just recognizes that a lot and just says, hey, all of this, for me, it's a little bit more about the tight space, the space in which it's all happening. It just feels more condensed and that's just me winging it in terms of urban space, but I feel that way, that space. And what does that mean in terms of the space between of interactions of organisms and people? So yeah, I think that nature values humans for lots of things.
So you're saying that humans like to mix it up.
I was saying nature's valuing us as an organism within it. So it's not, so the value doesn't come from us as it would in an economic way. It comes from the other. And so watching that, and I would say we had a really great trip of about 40, would you say, how many, 20, 30, 40 of our colleagues all got together, and Bonnie, along with Darlene St. Clair, organized a trip along the Dakota sacred sites in St. Paul. And so just beginning to rethink of these relationships through a different knowledge system, which has its own formations of where are the boundaries and lines, right? I mean, and as I study nation states, water and boundaries and political boundaries, that's really an interesting thing to study, and how that works with organisms as they do things, and us as organisms. So for me, it's all one package.
Is there another question that we want to cover really quickly, Claire, or can I?
I'll kick it back to you. I'll save some of these for later. We'll see where the conversation goes.
Sounds like there's some good ones coming in for later. I like it. Thanks. So I am curious a little bit, sort of what sets a subdiscipline of like urban ecology apart, and what are the big questions that kind of define that as a field? And Kristen, I'll bounce it right actually back to you, because you had said something about the things being condensed. And is that, in your mind, what sets this apart fundamentally? Is this spatial relationship? I'm just curious.
That's me thinking and talking. So I'm going to ask the people that are urban ecologists to answer this. Sarah, rescue me. But for me, that is one piece, is that the spatial relationships of things. And it's true for humans too. Think of who you are as a human being and how you create your relationships with others in an urban space versus in other spaces. Sarah, do you want to talk about some of the other questions? The other one that I'm really excited about is the evolutionary questions, and we don't have that colleague.
Yeah, I mean, I think that your question is actually sort of huge, but I mean, I think some of the things that set urban ecology apart are one, this coupling of people and nature, that we really can't. You can actually go to some systems. I mean, I've worked up in northern Alaska, and you can study that system without thinking too much about sort of the decisions of individual people. I mean, climate change is a huge deal in northern Alaska. That part of the world is warming faster than any other place on the planet. There are, long distance transported pollutants like mercury that are a big deal in northern Alaska. So back to Bonnie's point earlier, that, there's not really any place that you can go on the planet that's not touched by people. But I think what's maybe different is that in the city, everybody's decisions, like at an individual up to collective scales, either informally and formally, and this is the stuff that Kristen loves to think about. All of those decisions are impacting nature, right? So we can't study it without thinking really about that close coupling with people. And then there are other things that set cities apart, just sort of biophysically. I mean, they have unique characteristics. There's lots of impervious surface, right? So we've paved over lots of areas in cities, and that has consequences for hydrology, for energy exchange. And that has all sorts of then, follow-on consequences for things like water quality, et cetera. And we also, cities they're hotter, right? They're hotter than their surroundings on average. And so cities have unique environments, and they're very fragmented. So the urban nature is found in pockets, right, that are then disconnected from one another by all of this impervious surface. So to me, it's like this unique environment that we've created, and then also this close coupling between people and ecosystems that set urban ecosystems, urban ecology apart.
So that's actually, that might be a really good segue into, we've talked a lot about, what is nature and this nature component, but as we're talking about urban nature, urban ecology, urban studies of these sorts of things, I mean, it seems like, by definition, you almost have to include people in that. And so I am really curious, because I can imagine that, if you have the permission of whomever you need to get to study that piece of tundra in Alaska, you're kind of good to go and you can cover that. But with the, how you talked about fragmentation, I was thinking about fragmentation of property ownership and various, municipalities and all of these sorts of things. So how do you go about engaging with people when you need to study in their yards and cities? How do you do that? And to anyone.
I mean, I don't want to I could certainly talk about that. I mean, so we deal with that a lot. In fact, I mean, I was kind of waiting for Kristen to pipe up, because she's actually really interested in this sort of fragmented governance, that you've got people managing their lawns, and then you've got municipalities that are managing things at a certain scale. So she can talk more about that. But yeah, it's all about, we have to talk to people, right? And so one difference between working in the tundra and working in people's yards is, I need to get permission from lots of, and we've done this, we've actually done work in dozens and dozens of yards around the Twin Cities. So we need to get permission to do that. We need to train the people that work for us to be respectful and careful. And we also need to think about giving back to those folks who have allowed us to do work in their yards. So when I worked in the tundra, I would collect my data, and I didn't have to worry about sharing those results with, I would share those results with the scientific community, right? Because that's my obligation as a scientist. But there wasn't any landowner necessarily. It was, it's all BLM land up there. And I didn't have to really think that much about okay, the BLM has allowed me to work on this land, and I should be, sharing those results with them. But with homeowners, we have to think a lot about that, so these people have allowed us to come in and do sampling in their yards and spaces. And so what can I give back to those folks? Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess, and maybe for Kristen or Bonnie, I don't know, I imagine that there are different responses that you get from different groups of people who maybe have different sets of priorities or interests. And so, I mean, how do you manage that? How do you manage the potential? And maybe I'm wrong, maybe everybody's on board and loves it, I don't know, but how do you manage the differences in those things and how you engage with the people who live there?
Bonnie, do you want to talk a little bit about more community level engagement?
I mean, I've never had to ask, I don't do studies on people's yards. So maybe you should answer that, Kristen. And then, yeah, I'll pass it to you on this one.
All right. So, I mean, one of the things is if you go in as a partner, and in the same way as sometimes I might add stuff to my work that I wasn't thinking about doing because it's something the community wants to do. I don't usually do that at an individual homeowner level, but when we're working with communities, we add things to the work that sometimes lead to really interesting questions later as we put it within some of the more theoretical stuff we're looking at. But having concrete data that responds to immediate needs And that might have to do with a certain invasive weed or something like that. And then sharing the data, not just sharing an outcome, but sort of talking through how that knowledge was created is a conversation. How do you know that? And so for me, I'm always like asking soil scientists, well, what do you mean by that? How do you know that? Because I don't know that. I don't know much below ground at all. So, I'm always wondering how they're coming to those conclusions. Now, what do you do respectfully if you find something, I thought you might be suggesting that, what if they don't want you to say that there's a rusty patch bumblebee there, and because that's protected?
It's actually a little bit about, and that was going to get to that in a little bit. You're a little ahead of my.
Okay, sorry.
No, if that's where we are, that's great. But yeah, I mean, I do wonder, because sometimes ecology gets confused with advocacy. It gets confused with like environmental advocacy or whatever else. And when you start bringing in the social concerns of people to these studies, then I think that, what happens if you find an outcome that doesn't agree with whatever the group you've been engaging with wants the outcome to be? I mean, that's got to create potential tension for future interactions, I would think, but I don't know.
For me, the only place that's been a problem is when there's industrial secrets and we find certain pollutants in water streams or in soil. But usually I'm not funded by those folks. So it's publicly available data. So that's where I've had challenges, and I choose not to get funding for stuff like that. The other possibility for me is I work with, if I'm working with communities, they speak to what they found. So they speak first, and then I may speak about stuff. So there may be differences of opinion or different ways of thinking about it, but everybody gets to provide their voice of what they believe is going on.
Alex, I was going to say, I had a project several years ago where I was working with an environmental organization who was very keen on promoting the benefits of street trees as mitigating air pollution. And, I went and read the literature and tried to really educate myself about it. And it's one of these topics that's actually not real clear cut. Like, trees, yes, do have a filtration role, but they also can trap pollution at the pedestrian level, especially in dense urban canopies. So if you can imagine, there's a lot of vehicle traffic and they've got tall buildings on both sides and a big downtown corridor. And then you plant a bunch of street trees there, that those exhaust emissions end up just getting trapped right under that canopy and expose people to higher levels of particulate pollution. And that was definitely not the answer that this tree planting organization wanted to hear. But it's a reflection of the complexity of the science. And so, I do think that there's conclusions that, may run contrary to the agendas of certain groups. And that's part of doing science. There's always a political dimension to the work that we do. But I think we're really careful in thinking about which questions we privilege, who we bring in to structure the kinds of things that we're investigating. But it's important to follow those lines of evidence where they lead you. So.
Well, I'm curious, in your experience, have groups like that been responsive to the fact that, maybe it's not clear cut, or have they just decided like, well, this is the stuff we'll look at then because it supports what our preconceived decision?
I'm going to say no comment on that one.
Sold. Moving on. No, I'm just curious because I feel like science, what we've seen this recently in the past couple of years with the pandemic, which I know is not exactly on topic, but as our understanding of things change, it can be frustrating often for the public to hear one thing and then find out that something else is actually, there's actually much more support for this. And so I think bringing that into communities has the potential to create the same kinds of conflicts. And I was just curious about how that plays out in that scenario in a way that you don't have to worry about if you are doing the I'm going to get this wrong now, Sarah, the LTER that's in the middle of the ocean, right? Like that one, probably less conflict if you find out something there. So I was just curious. But to me, the bringing in of people in this adds a layer of complexity and nuance that I think is unique. And as I'm starting to understand it, I see this as urban ecology, as that being this really integral piece, if I'm understanding what all of you are saying. And so maybe I'd like to take a more, that might sound like a negative spin on it back there, but I'm also curious about the potential for bringing people in and getting them engaged. I know that for maybe the past decade or so, there's been a lot of effort towards citizen science, and bringing people in to engage in either collecting or helping with data, or getting a sense of ownership of some projects. And I would imagine that in an urban setting, there's just a ton of opportunity for that. Is that useful in an urban setting? Is it critical, or is it something that I'm just making up as I go along?
No, I think there's all sorts of potential. And so this project that the three of us are now a part of is new. It's just started in March, so we haven't gotten those kinds of efforts off the ground, but we certainly have had really successful experiences engaging citizens in the past. So just as an example, we had a project that where we had homeowners monitoring the phenology, or the timing of biological events across the season for street trees. This sort of building off of what Bonnie said, a lot of what I've been doing has been related to understanding the role of trees as sources of nutrient pollution to stormwater, which is kind of getting at what you were talking about earlier, Alex, that, actually trees are really effective at moving nutrients into streets and into storm drains. And we find that they're an important source of nutrient pollutants. And so sometimes I get asked, well, do you think we shouldn't have any trees in cities? And, that's where it's like, well, let's think about all the benefits and potential burdens that we get from trees, and there are trade-offs, and maybe we can manage things differently so that we can, prevent those negative effects.
How was that not your most surprising thing that you've been told?
Yeah, well, yeah.
Trees. I feel like that would have been great.
Okay, sorry. Well, okay, I brought it up now. Yeah, I don't ever say no, we shouldn't have any trees in the city. But anyway, we got all these homeowners to track the phenology of different species, and it was great because we got really great data on when different species drop their leaves. And it turns out that, it's just like, it's fascinating to me because, so it turns out that there's quite a lot of variation. And if you look right now, you'll see the early species are things like ash and red maple. And then we get the silver maples and the Norways, and then later the oaks. And so there's this whole progression. And so if you're trying to manage a street sweeping program, for example, to prevent nutrient pollution, then it becomes really complicated when you have this diversity of trees in your urban tree canopy. But we know that diversity is good in terms of resisting diseases and pathogens and pests like emerald ash borer or Dutch elm disease. So yeah, citizen science, or science that where people in the city are gathering data, there's a lot of potential there, and I'm sure that's something that we'll be trying to those folks, people who are interested in doing that will be people that we'll be engaging with as we move forward.
And I just have to add in that if your science isn't suggesting a little bit of conflict to the status quo and norm of what we think, maybe we're not asking the right questions. So as we start asking social justice questions or diversity questions, these are questions that haven't been asked, and there's a reason they haven't been asked. And so even when it comes to a tree, as somebody from the forestry department, maybe not enough was asked about that. So, these are, I like a little conflict because it means you might be focusing on something that is important to think about. And if you can manage it. I know right now is not a good time to talk about trying to manage conflict, but.
I would just follow up on the citizen science thing, Alex, because I think it's so interesting and such a rich area in urban ecology and urban systems in particular, because there's so many people in those systems. And one of the things that I've been excited about and I'm piloting in some urban nature in Duluth is the deployment of chatbots and along trails and in urban areas. And so this is it's just a sign and it says, text this number and with the number of cars you see in the parking lot, or text the number of people that you see on the trail. And then they, somebody writes that number into their cell phone, sends a text with the number 4 or 5. And then the chatbot spits back at them a series of questions that can ask things about perceptions of safety or how far they travel to get to that trail. And we've just had this an incredible amount of data that have come from these chatbots deployed in Duluth. And I'm really interested in using the wealth of geographically supplied social media type data sources that give a window into how people view the urban environment that we've never had access to before. And another great example, my colleague Yingling Fan, who's here at the Humphrey School, did this really cool study where they looked at the perceived wait times at different bus stops in the Twin Cities. And they found that people felt like their bus wait was lower when they had view of trees from where they were standing. So this is just by how long did you think you waited for that bus? And people be like, oh, I thought I had to wait 5 minutes or 10 minutes. And it turned, and then they knew how long people actually had to wait. So there's these applications that allow us to get a window into how people perceive the urban environment that we've never had access to before. And my colleagues in Atlanta have done a lot of work on what they call street science, which is really empowering communities via their cell phones to document their experience of urban nature. And that provides, it really democratizes the data that we get about how people move through the urban environment, how they perceive it, what they determine as beautiful, what they determine as safe, what's culturally relevant. And there's, I think, so much we could learn from those non-traditional data sources.
Wow. So some use for those pesky polluting trees. That's good. So I wanted to break away again. I know we're kind of running past time here already, though. So instead of doing that, I'll just do one last question. So I'm curious, with the urban LTER coming here, with all of these different types of data that are going to be collected in our communities in the Twin Cities, what are the best outcomes for these communities as you get more urban study going on in those communities? And I'd like to hear from all three of you on that one, because I think it'll be very different perspectives. Don't all rush at once.
All right, I'll start. So one of the things in terms of policy and practice is that we don't have a lot of good studies on a long-term basis. Do various activities people are doing, do they really matter? And how do they matter over time? So we do have policy tweaks, and healthcare has a lot more than we do in some of the urban work and the ecology work. So I think keeping people invested and actually doing things that are effective rather than doing just because we feel like we have to do. I think that having that long-term piece and having data sets that could be used at the level of a city for making decisions. So cities with 114 cities in the Minneapolis, St. Paul metro area. And so if we can do that, and then we can I think that long-term component will help with planning and decision-making a lot.
So it'll give them the opportunity for real sort of high resolution kind of database decision-making on where they want to go.
Over time.
Okay.
Over time. So the chance of actually being able to compare to what others are doing and see some kind of effective change and be able to modify as a result.
Excellent.
I mean, I think Minneapolis, the Twin Cities, is an amazing place to ask these questions, right? There's a lot of spotlight on the Twin Cities right now because of the uprisings last summer, because of our known disparities in both our racial wealth gap, the amount of home ownership of Black households versus white households, the distribution of urban nature, the impact of racially restrictive housing covenants on access to urban nature, the distribution of toxins across our city, at the same time that we're consistently the number 1, number 2, number 3 ranked park system. We have dozens and dozens of urban lakes. We have this jewel of a park system that runs through our cities. We're also in a city that is pretty sprawly, and so therefore has pockets of density and pockets of more rural areas. We're at different transitions between biomes. We have all this interesting municipal tiers of decision making, and we have watershed districts. So I think the other thing that's really motivating about cities is that they're places to make changes. I mean, some of the work that Sarah and Kristen have done have already made it into decisions that managers are making in the urban areas. And I've worked with them like Parks and Recreation Board over the last couple of years, and we've seen the impact of our work translate into policy, translate into management decisions. That's not always possible at the federal level, but it's possible at the city level, at the municipal level. And we've got grand challenges. You know, we've got social justice challenges, we've got sustainable development challenges, we've got climate change, we've got management of our urban environment, we've got biodiversity challenges. We have a diverse immigrant community that's building unique relationships with the urban environment that are very different than how we originally conceptualized who would use the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul in our park system. So I think to be successful is to really embrace that complexity and to be able to say something about what the future of the urban space should look like, for whom into the future, and to be able to really promote solutions to the suite of challenges that our cities face and our communities face, that we can demonstrate that this project actually had a tangible impact going forward. I mean, that's what really motivates me, and I think the potential is there.
So I'm curious if you can or are able to give a sort of a concrete example of the type of thing that you're talking about in terms of being responsive to modifying how an urban space is used, not necessarily by any specific group, but just in general. Because for me, it's like I understand what you're talking about. It's sort of hard to picture in concrete terms, and so I would love to have that made a little bit more concrete for, you know, I'm slow. The audience is fine, but I need some help here.
Yeah, I mean, Sarah can probably give some examples with the street sweeping work that she's done, so maybe I'll pass it to her.
Yeah, actually we'll give it, I think I want to talk about lakes. So we have so many lakes here, right? And there's been a huge amount of effort of money invested in managing for lake water quality. And we have an incredible richness of long-term data, and but it's in lots of different places. And so one of the things that we're hoping to do is to be able to pull a lot of that data together and say something about, okay, so, you know, are these investments in managing for lake water quality making a difference over the long term? You know, we actually, if you look across all the lakes in the Twin Cities metro, some lakes are improving in their water quality, some lakes are declining in water quality, some lakes are staying the same. And we don't have a good sense of why we see that variation. Is it because of variation in management? Or is it something else about these lakes that's influencing why some are improving and some are declining in terms of their quality? And so that's the kind of question, that's an example of a question that we're really interested in addressing, and then linking that to things that, you know, Kristen is interested in, like, okay, so, you know, which policies, which actions seem to be most effective in influencing water quality? Why, you know, there's all this variation across cities and how they're dealing with water quality. And so, which actions lead to outcomes that have environmental benefits, and who's benefiting from those improvements in the environment. So those hopefully that's a more concrete example of something that we're hoping to address.
I guess so. To me, the outside of what the specific inputs are into that, water quality issues you could deal with on, a variety of scales, and so I'm still curious, in the so that to me, you could be looking at water quality in the boundary waters, which is not particularly urban and not particularly human impacted by design. But that wouldn't be something that would be specific to urban ecology, if that makes sense, right? Like to me, well, maybe I'm still having trouble with the nature versus not, but the inputs might be different, but the processes should be similar. Or
so they're somewhat similar, but going back to what I said way back at the beginning, think about the urban form. Like, think about how urban systems are constructed. And one of the things that we've done is, we built roads, right? Because it's a lot easier to get around on paved roads than unpaved roads. And because we had all this pavement, we started having trouble getting water off the landscape because this pavement is impervious to water. And so then it's like, okay, then we need to build a drainage system that rapidly moves water off of the landscape. And so one of the unintended consequences of that is that these drainage systems are not only effective at moving water off the landscape, but they're also really effective at moving pollutants off the landscape. And so we have greatly increased what we call the hydrologic connectivity between our landscapes and our urban waterways, so that we're super effective actually at moving pollutants into our waters. And we've also removed most of the wetlands that would filter a lot of those nutrients. So if you're up in the boundary waters, you're going to notice there's a lot of wetlands around that are, first of all, you don't have as many nutrient pollutants coming into the system. You also don't have systems in place like wetlands, riparian areas along rivers that are going to remove those nutrients. So the urban system itself, we have high pollutant loads, and we also have this system that is actually really effective at moving pollutants into our waterways. And then we have, these lakes, besides being more polluted, they're hotter, which has implications for things like cyanobacteria that produce toxins and, harmful algal blooms. So it is a really different system because of the way that urban systems are created and the form of an urban system. They function actually pretty differently than, say, a boundary waters system.
Well, and to me, I think I better understand now too, in that learning those pieces of it might allow a municipality that chooses to do so to modify some of those runoff issues in ways in new or repair and infrastructure kinds of projects that could change that outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. So, if you think about managing, just to keep going with this lakes and nutrient pollution issue, maybe we can sweep our streets more frequently in the fall so that we remove more of that nutrient-rich leaf litter that might otherwise end up going down the storm drain and into the lake. Or, maybe we can put in a stormwater management feature that is essentially some kind of a wetland feature that slows down the water, that traps those nutrients. And that's what a lot of, stormwater ponds and the like are basically, trying to do, rain gardens, et cetera. So, thinking about ways that we can then modify the urban landscape to restore some of that more natural hydrologic function that would slow down the water on the landscape, allow for, opportunities for pollutants to be retained, held, trapped before they get into the water bodies that we care about.
All right, excellent. So I do want to make sure that we address the questions. I'm sure the audience at this point has a number of burning questions
They
that
sure do.
been holding on to and can't wait to share with us.
They do. We'll do our best to get to as many as we can. So one common theme that has come up with some questions is climate change and cities. And I know we could have an entirely different Petri dish focused on that topic. But I'll start with kind of a specific question that someone asked. So what do you expect climate change to affect urban nature? How do you affect climate change to affect urban nature? And how is it already affecting urban nature, especially the migration of animals, plants, and insects?
Yeah, so I can try to tackle that, and others can weigh in as well. So I'm going to be honest with you. I haven't thought about it as much in the context of migration of animals. I have thought a lot about it in the context of water and lakes. So I mean, so one of the things that is characterizing climate change in this part of the world is that we're getting more intense storm events. And so, you know, as we were talking about earlier with impervious surfaces, then there's basically this interaction, this synergy between climate change and the way that we construct our urban systems. Because if we're getting more intense storms, we're getting storms that are exceeding the capacity of the stormwater drainage networks that we've constructed. And so that is a big deal. And so a lot of cities are actually trying to use urban nature as a way to basically supplement or complement or enhance the functioning of storm drain networks by trying to hold more water on the landscape, you know, let water soak into the landscape by building, you know, features like rain gardens, et cetera, that can then make it so that we don't have to basically tear out all of our existing stormwater infrastructure and replace it with bigger pipes that can handle these more intense storms. And then the other big thing about climate change, of course, is that most cities are already hotter than the surrounding landscape. And so we have this urban heat island effect, and then we're warming up the climate on top of that. And so that is creating really extreme temperatures. And, you know, you may have seen stories in the news in the last couple of years about places like Phoenix, for example, where it's becoming impossible from a human health perspective to actually work outside. And of course, the people who are outdoor laborers are people of color, they're immigrants, you know, so those groups are being disproportionately affected by climate change in the cities because the urban heat island effect is exacerbating those extreme temperatures. So those are just a couple of examples, but like you said, I mean, we could talk a lot about climate change in cities.
Yeah, does anyone else have anything to add about that specific?
Well, the only other
You
piece
stole my second question, Sarah, which is just broadly, so that's good. Go ahead, Kristen.
The only thing I would add, just because I've been associated with the Billion Birds, the Loss of a Billion Birds scholarship, and I think that there's, you know, cities have a particular role. It's not unique to birds, but it's a role in terms of these chains and networks of cities that we create that influence what's going on. And so birds that are moving through and landing in cities and having a different situation, different food sources or lack thereof. And think about our, you know, the sub-basin of the Mississippi River and the cities that are moving across that and the birds that are flowing to Columbia. So I think that where cities are systems within systems, and they're not that, by using the term city, we're thinking political boundary, but they're not ecological boundaries. And so we're influencing our proximate rural as well as our rural, you know, across, say, the upper Midwest or beyond. And so being able to think at that level, and us being a node that really has some good science and some good set of questions that can be shared across multiple cities, I think is an exciting possibility.
Can I do another one, Alex?
Absolutely.
Cool. So the next sort of theme of questions is more about what is the plan for communicating findings to people that you engage with, either in their backyard or more broadly, residents of the city. I know it's still early yet, and I think what you said, March, Sarah, was when everything sort of officially kicked off. I know things have been in the works for a while longer, but I was curious if someone could touch on maybe a couple of examples of sort of that strategy. And this was in the context, I'll put it in the context of the question went to, how do we inform people to make democratic decisions in elections, right? So like, how do we provide people with more information about the place they are living to ultimately maybe vote someone on the park board, or not vote for someone on the park board, or how do you kind of and down the line, so like, how does the communication about research that's happening with this project potentially help make for more informed voter?
Well, I'll say a couple of things and then ask Sarah to talk maybe about the Bell Museum collaboration, because I think that's a really cool part of what we have planned and connects to education, K through 12 education. But I think one of the core parts of this project that I think is unique, and this is, I think, a trend in science in general, is to try and reject the deficit model that if only people knew, then they would do different things or make different decisions. Because that positions the university and researchers as like in charge of imparting our wisdom upon the uneducated public, which I don't think is true in most cases. And I think built into the structure of this project is really a lot of co-development with partners and a lot of listening to the needs and concerns of communities that are an integral part of the urban environment, and their challenges and their visions for what a sustainable and a healthy city and good urban nature looks like are going to be really different than what we might come up with in the university. So I think it's also part of identifying where the knowledge gaps are with those people who are really trying to mobilize to make the change that they want to see in the world, and to make sure that they have access to the resources of a research university to really help empower them to understand their environment in a way that allows them to better advocate for those futures.
Yeah, thanks, Bonnie. Yeah, so yeah, I'll just let that, Bonnie articulated it super well, so I'll just go with that. So just a couple of things, like practical things, like if you're interested in learning more about our project, we do have a website. It's a baby website, right? We're just starting. We are planning to start publishing a public newsletter, and there's a place on the website where you can sign up to receive that. We have not published one yet, but that's something that we are planning to do. But Bonnie talked about the our K-12 program, so we're super excited about our partnership with the Bell Museum. We have a so-called schoolyard LTER program, and our ultimate goal is to basically engage with all of the middle school learners in St. Paul and Minneapolis. So we've already gotten some donor funding to match the funding that we're getting from NSF to be able to bring learners from middle schools around the Minneapolis-St. Paul area to the Bell Museum. And then we are really excited about working with teachers to develop resources that they can use to teach the middle school science standards to their students using the urban nature that they find around their school. So we recognize that it's difficult for teachers, for students to get to the Bell Museum. And so we're kind of hoping to bring the Bell Museum to them so that they can actually have the resources that they need to learn about urban nature, but in the context of the state science standards that are being targeted for middle school learners. So that's one thing that will be happening that we're really excited about. But yeah, just to build on what Bonnie is saying, I think, we're not necessarily about trying to just give our, impart our knowledge, right? We really want to work with communities, you know, particularly communities that maybe have not had an opportunity to be at the table, you know, with university researchers, to understand what their concerns are and what they feel is important to understand related to urban nature, so that we actually want to study that process of what happens to the researchers and the research and the community partners through that relationship building and those conversations over the long term. So that's actually kind of built into some of the research that we're doing.
Excellent. Claire, do you have maybe one more quick question we can fit in?
I think, I mean, yes, but I think that's a really nice kind of sentiment to end on.
Sure. All right.
So there are a lot more questions. Sorry we didn't get to all of them, but I think that was kind of a nice, otherwise we could be on here for another 20 minutes and I want to respect people's Wednesday nights.
That's true. Well, before we go, I do want to thank all of our incredible panelists. Again, you were wonderful, and I know I learned a ton. It was fantastic. And also thank you to all of our audience members who joined us from far afield. So, and also near to home. So thank you all very much. And hopefully we will see you all at the next Petri Dish next month.
Thanks, everyone.